Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So friends, here's part two of my interview with Inspector General and Pandemic Fund Watchdog, Bob Westbrooks. I recently had an opportunity to sit down and interview a gentleman named Bob Westbrooks. Who is Bob Westbrooks? You're about to find out. He is a somewhat quiet, reserved, behind the scenes, extraordinary public servant. And Bob authored a book. Here it is. It's titled Left Holding the Bag. Bob Westbrooks, as you can see there, is the former Inspector General and Pandemic Watchdog. And Left Holding the Bag is a watchdog's account of how Washington fumbled its COVID test. And if we turn to the back of the book, there's a quote from President Biden. Quote, "The American people deserve to know that their tax dollars are being spent as intended. My message to those cheats out there is this: you can't hide. We're going to find you. We're going to make you pay back what you stole and hold you accountable under the law." And Bob Westbrooks, as the Inspector General, as the watchdog over how pandemic relief money was being spent, was in a very real sense taking point on trying to root out crime, corruption, fraud, waste, and abuse. Trying to hold accountable those people who would take advantage of a national pandemic, indeed a worldwide pandemic, and use it as an opportunity to steal from the American taxpayers. That's who Bob Westbrooks is. So I hope you enjoy this interview with Bob Westbrooks, and I know I certainly appreciate his efforts to be a watchdog over how our tax dollars are spent. The reason I'm really excited to talk with Bob is he has written a remarkable book. It's going to be a very important historical reference for how our federal government handled the pandemic. The title of the book is Left Holding the Bag, a watchdog's account of how Washington fumbled its COVID test. Here is what Bob writes early on in chapter 1. He said, "We lost loved ones who needlessly died, convinced COVID-19 was all a hoax."
Truly, just that it's just tragic that we lost loved ones and neighbors who literally would fight doctors on their deathbed because of the misinformation. So I raise that as an issue. I raise it as a matter for congressional consideration at the end of the book, because we have to deal with the issue of misinformation in America and disinformation. And that started from the very beginning. I note in the book that we didn't even think about the pandemic. It wasn't on most people's radar fully until March of 2020. But at the end of January of 2020, Facebook was already putting out an alert or a public service announcement saying, people, please don't drink bleach to cure COVID. What you're hearing about from coming from overseas, do not drink bleach, because our adversaries, for a few dollars, for a couple of ads, they would have people at the Internet Research Agency that were just bombarding us on social media, getting us to divide. That's really what they intended to do. And they were very successful at it.
I hope everybody will read this book, and I am almost certain it will make people angry, frustrated, disheartened. It will also give them hope and make them appreciate the role of inspectors general. But boy, you go through a bit of an emotional roller coaster when you read this book. So here's what you say. During the pandemic emergency, federal investigators from multiple law enforcement agencies worked thousands of pandemic fraud investigations involving novice, experienced, and professional criminals. And these are people who not only stole, in a very real sense, our tax dollars, but they did it at the expense of lives that the federal government was trying to save. Even though I know there's crime everywhere, it was my business to get after it for decades. This still knocks the justice wind out of me when I see the breadth of the people who were engaged in this kind of fraud at the expense of their fellow citizens. So with that, I'm going to sit back and let my blood pressure come down a little bit. And I would love for you to give us kind of a basic tutorial on kind of the CARES Act, what it is or what it was, and PPE. And then we'll get into how you tried to keep fraud, waste, abuse, corruption in check as the executive director of the PRAC.
Quick timeline to give folks a little bit of context here. The day that the pandemic became real and the day that changed everything, according to, at least according to ESPN and NPR, was March 11th, 2020. That was the day that the NBA canceled the season indefinitely. There was an NBA player that tested positive and they canceled the season. Before that, we were like, we're not sure if how this pandemic is going to play out, and we were getting mixed messages from the White House. But on the 11th, the NBA said, we're canceling the season indefinitely. And then Tom Hanks, who was in Australia, on Instagram posted that him and his wife got COVID. It got like 3 million likes. Well, by the end of the week, the president declared a national emergency. And then by the 20th of March, Senate Republicans had a bill that they drafted, which ultimately became the CARES Act. That piece of legislation, it was 300 pages long, no hearings on it, no public debate on it, no public scrutiny of it. They floated the bill with the IG community originally for some comment. I say that the legislative gestation period of the CARES Act, which was the largest relief bill in U.S. history, $2 trillion, was 7 days from the Republicans saying we have a bill until it passed and was signed by the president. 7 days, pretty remarkable. In that bill, so at the time, that was the largest piece of relief legislation we had in the United States. The Recovery Act of 2008 with the subprime mortgage crisis and the Great Recession, that was the last time we had a big bill. That was only $800 billion. So now we had $2 trillion. And then there were 6 pieces of legislation over the next year. Congress kept adding more money to certain programs. And then almost a year later, President Biden was now in office and we were facing a recession in America. So we were worried that the economy was going to crash again in recovery mode. So Congress passed the American Rescue Plan, which doubled the CARES Act. So $2 more trillion. So all combined, it was about $5 trillion through all the various bills to 426 different federal programs in about 40 agencies. So if I were to summarize those categories, you had some of this was tax benefits. Everybody remembers the stimulus checks they got. Well, that was money that was given to IRS and Treasury to stimulate spending. So a big pot of money was for the stimulus checks. Another big pot of money was to help what we call the backbone of the U.S. economy, which is small business. It's like, how do we help small business quickly as possible? So there were essentially 2 versions of small business relief that we gave out. One was called the Paycheck Protection Program. Somebody said, well, the Small Business Administration is already in the business working with delegated banks, right? Already normal times, pre-pandemic, they already give small business loans that are guaranteed by the federal government if the small business borrower defaults. Why don't we repurpose that program? And initially, they gave $346 billion to the Small Business Administration to give out. They blew through that money in 14 days. 14 days. They gave out 1.7 million loans, $346 billion went out the door before I even started my job. It was out the door. So that was one program. Another big pot of money was in a Paycheck Protection Program. What was unique about it, we pretended that they were loans, but they weren't loans. Because if you promised and swore, Scout's honor, that you use the money to pay your employees, which you could be an employee of your small company, if you promise that you use that for payroll and money's fungible, then the government would forgive your loan. So it's really a grant, not a loan.
Not only do we know that we have lots of folks out there just ready to abuse this for their own financial gain, but I'm sorry, we also had a president and members of his family who were, I call them play cabinet members, play administration members, some of them, who are now on trial for massive, systemic, decades-long business fraud in New York. So talk about the perfect storm for fraud, waste, abuse, crime, and corruption to explode. This seems like it. And what you wrote about the PPP program, and you just shared with us, is it was basically run on the honor system. And when I read that in your book, I wrote in the margins, you know, James Bond had a license to kill. This kind of feels like a license to fraud.
It absolutely was a license to steal. You know, a week after I got appointed, the very first federal charges happened in Rhode Island. So people realized this immediately. And they could realize it. First of all, they came to their senses. They go, wait, are you telling me this is all based on the honor system? Nobody's going to check my records? That's like going in, imagine going into a bank to buying a new car and you're like, hey, I want to buy a Lamborghini. I promise to pay back the money. And they don't look at your income. They don't look at your assets. And they go, okay, yeah, here's the keys. It just doesn't happen. But it did here. So I write about the first case. It was in Rhode Island. It really is a quaint case from a prosecutor or agent standpoint. You're like, oh, those were quaint, lovely times because we didn't know what was ahead of us. And the FBI agent said, okay, we've got these false representations on these loan documents. Two guys claimed to own these restaurants with all these employees, and they didn't. All lies. So the FBI agent, like, why don't we do an undercover phone call? Like every agent loves to do an undercover phone call. So you tape the guy, hey, there's a smudge on your form. Can you tell us again how many employees you have? That kind of stuff. And they were able to indict pretty quickly on those charges within days, right? The federal law enforcement community was flooded with fraud cases from all over the world. And the days of doing an undercover phone call were long past. It was really sort of trying to do in real time as much as possible these paper cases. We saw it from all over the globe. And one thing I do want to stress to our listeners, we had domestic and foreign bad actors, right? So you had, and I think it's critically important to realize, at the top of the food chain, the Secret Service has acknowledged publicly that there's a Chinese military hacker group called APT-41, Advanced Persistent Threat 41. They're a hacker group in the military, intel side. Their whole job is to hack into our systems. They do it in shifts, and they're very good at it. They were the ones responsible, and several of them were indicted for the Equifax breach. If folks remember, 145 million of all of your records and my records were stolen or on the dark web. They were identified as responsible for that, had been indicted for it, and we've identified some pandemic fraud related to that same group. You have foreigners. You've got Nigerian gangs. You had South African gangs. In the United States, we had prison gangs that were just filing scores and scores and scores of fraudulent unemployment insurance applications. What's going to happen to them? You had street prison gangs that actually shifted their focus from drug street crime to pandemic fraud because it was so easy. It was easy money. So we had this large attack surface. It wasn't just, there were 426 different programs. Most of the fraud happened in the small business program, the PPP, the disaster loan program that also was operated by SBA, and then the unemployment insurance programs, which are a federally funded program, but they're operated by the states. We found instances where an individual used the same Social Security number in 40 states to file for benefits. The one data point I find most shocking, and this will tell you the sense of the scope of this. Former Governor Larry Hogan of Maryland, my former governor, who was the chair of the National Governors Association, the second month of the pandemic, he had a press conference announcing that they had stopped a fraud scheme, an international fraud ring that had attempted to file 47,000 fraudulent unemployment insurance benefit claims in Maryland to the tune of $500 million. Now, unemployment insurance benefits are very small. So that's a lot of benefits, a lot of claims there. Luckily, they were identified, but you're talking about these are folks coming from overseas, and they're very difficult to prosecute those cases, as you know.
And if you fail to prosecute something, you are not only failing to deter future crime, but you're encouraging it. You're giving people a blueprint how to steal and get away with it. On page 93 of your book, you put in all bold type, nobody in the federal government had a clear view into where all the federal pandemic money was going. But there's one other criminal organization that I want to ask you about briefly. Did members of Congress also take advantage of these forgivable PPP loans?
They did. They did. There was at least 12 members of Congress either got PPP loans themselves or were associated and a significant owner of a family business. What's interesting about that, in normal times with the SBA, they have controls in place. If a member of Congress wants to get a small business loan, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but there's a control in place to make sure there's not undue pressure. So SBA is a screening committee that is supposed to evaluate loans from Congress. Well, what I found outrageous and just totally unnecessary from a public trust standpoint was the SBA eliminated that requirement in the early stage of the pandemic. They said, well, we're not going to approve. We're just going to blanket approve and assume that all loans to members of Congress, like from a matter of public trust, why would you do that? Why would you incur that self-inflicted wound unless you're contemptuous of public trust and accountability, right? It's like you don't think anybody's going to hold you accountable, so nobody's going to complain about it. Just go ahead and do it.
Do you have a sense of how much of the CARES Act, the Pandemic Relief Act money was lost to fraud?
Yeah, I put it at roughly $500 billion. And I think that's a conservative estimate. The number keeps changing. The honest answer, the truthful answer is we will never know precisely how much money was stolen because of the lack of transparency. We will never know. But there's estimates from the Small Business Administration IG, there's estimates from the Government Accountability Office and from the Department of Labor IG. And when you put it all together, it's about $500 billion. You know, in normal times, high-risk federal programs suffer about a 10% fraud rate or improper payment rate. Normal times. These were not normal times, right? And so those federal programs that I talked about had fraud rates much higher than 10%. Some had the fraud rates probably closer to 20%. Some maybe even higher.
Do you have any ballpark sense? And I know counting up cases is a difficult proposition, and more cases are brought each week, if not each day. You have any sense of how many prosecutions may have been brought behind all of this massive fraud?
Yeah, there was just a press release on it from the Department of Justice. There's a task force on this. So there's been about 3,000 federal prosecutions to date. The astonishing thing, like everybody says, are we ever going to get the money back? No, we're not. A lot of the money's overseas. But with that said, the Secret Service has been working very hard with Small Business Administration IG. They were able to seize over $1 billion, and they were able to freeze at the banks and actually stop transactions another $3 billion. That's astonishing. That's a tremendous amount of money that they've been able to recover for the American people. So I got to hold them up. Any lawyer would love how they did it because it was very novel legal theories on how they were able to do the forfeiture. They did bulk forfeitures of this money sitting in banks. Instead of doing like 100 different forfeiture warrants, they were able to convince a judge to accept one single warrant. So it was very creative, novel, collaborative work across government. So I think American people need to know that as well.
Well, I'm so glad you brought some of the silver lining that's lurking behind that big dark cloud of fraud. So that is encouraging and heartening. Listen, I want to leave it there. We've been at this for a while, and I'm going to just reemphasize to everybody that if you want to learn a whole lot about how our government operated or failed to operate in handling this deadly pandemic, and if you want to be angered, but also given some optimism that we can do better, then I would recommend picking up Bob's book, Left Holding the Bag. Please give it a read. I can't tell you how grateful I am, not only for you being willing to sit down and do an extended interview, and not only for your authoring this book, which is a history book as much as anything else, but the public service that you continue to do, that you've done as an inspector general. I do feel like we have better days ahead because of the efforts of you and your colleagues. So, I thank you for your service and for your time today, Bob.
Thank you, Glenn. I appreciate it. Be well.